Live. Welcome to Terraform Thursday. Welcome to the HashiCorp Terraform Community Office Hours. Y'all look great today. I already see a couple of people in the chat. I'm very happy to get to take you on a tour of what's new with Terraform 0.14. I'm your host, excuse me. I'm your host, Kerim Satirli, and I'm joined today by Kristin Laemmert and Petros Kolyvas, who we'll talk to in a second. But before we kick off, just a quick reminder. If you have questions or comments during the session, we'd love for you to interact with us in the chat, usually on the right side of your screen. As you do so, please keep in mind that our code of conduct applies in this virtual space as well. In general, be welcoming, be inclusive, be respectful, just be a nice person. You can review the full code of conduct on our website, and we'll have a link for that in the chat as well. And with that, let's get started. So my name is Kerim Satirli. I'm a developer advocate at HashiCorp, where I focus on the infrastructure line of products. And I'm joined today by Terraform Core engineer Kristin Laemmert and Terraform Core product manager Petros Kolyvas. Thank you for being here today, you two, and welcome back, Petros.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so Kristin, for the folks that missed your sessions during HashiConf, because I think you generally give like one session at least per year, what is your role in the Terraform Core team?
I am a software developer on the Terraform Core team. I've been there for 2.5 years. Yes, that's it. I write code.
Awesome. Thank you. And Petros, I know we've asked this before, but for our new viewers, what do you do at HashiCorp?
That's a good question. Sometimes I wonder that myself, but not for having nothing to do. As the product manager of Terraform Core, I think I have a number of interesting responsibilities. Often, you know, the collaboration of sort of developing the kind of user feedback and research we need to drive the product forward, but also taking that and shaping it collaboratively with the engineering team. None of this work is done in a vacuum, and the engineering team at Core also, you know, interacts pretty widely with the provider SDK teams and provider teams, and then our Terraform Cloud and Enterprise teams. So there's a lot of coordination when we're thinking about any new feature and understanding sort of the knock-on effects it might have outside of our team. And then that I'm, you know, helpful for shepherding around and, you know, carrying things from one person to the next and making sure we all understand what we're doing and have a kind of clear vision moving forward. So yeah, nothing too useful.
Well, I think with Terraform 0.14 now, a lot of useful stuff has happened in the past few months. It's only been a few short months since we had 0.13, since we had this exact session where we talked about the cool stuff in 0.13, and here we are with more quality of life improvements. I'm excited about this. Kristin, what have you been working on with Terraform lately?
For Terraform 0.14, I've been focused on an entirely invisible to users behind the scenes refactor. So it's a massive quality life improvement for me. The example I like to give is I've taken several hundred lines out of the debug logs of just kind of confusing noise. So it's been a really fun project to work on, and like will be absolutely invisible and mean nothing to anyone who isn't actually deep in the Terraform code base on a daily basis.
I think the beauty is that so many people work behind the scenes to make the front end experience, if you want to call it that, so much smoother. And when you look at some of the features in 0.14, that's definitely something that's happening. Petros, what's your favorite 0.14 feature? Just going to put you on the spot like that.
Yeah, it's a hard one. You know, I think the interesting thing about 0.14, and so if I start rambling on here, cut me off because I have a habit of doing that. But we've got an hour and a captive audience, so you know. I think the interesting thing about 0.14 is more the sort of meta feature that, as challenging as it was for us to go from 0.13 so quickly to 0.14, is to begin to make those motions about stability and consistency that we want to represent the deliverable that is Terraform 1.0. There, I said it. And I think to tie this into Kristin's answer, those quality of life improvements that we need to make for the team, the kind of things that we're doing behind the scenes, are really critical for our long-term strategy, for making this tool maintainable for the long term, because we also really, really need to keep evolving it. We're all pretty aware that there are some deficiencies in sort of the Terraform experience. And in order to tackle those, we don't want to be bogged down by some of the other areas that have been challenging for us. But for like discrete features, and I think, I won't avoid your question completely, I am pretty excited by the possibilities of sensitive values, though it does genuinely terrify me how users are going to find ways to prove us wrong. And I kind of welcome that. Like, that's one of the most interesting aspects of the job, is seeing all the ways where something we create meets a user need we weren't even aware of, a practitioner need or an operator need, and then sort of needing to refactor our own thinking about what the tool is doing and how it's being used. So yeah, sensitive values. And then I have been talking a lot about the excitement of not needing an upgrade tool in 0.14, but I want to take this moment to actually caveat that, because I've gotten myself into some hot water here. So there is no upgrade tool in 0.14, and we largely agree that there are no breaking changes. However, it does require you to have upgraded to Terraform 0.13 first. And so when we say there's no upgrade tool, we are unfortunately not saying that wherever you are in Terraform land, you can just jump and avoid the pain of the upgrade process. Now, we hope it's not painful, and we keep trying to improve it in many ways. I think we have some exciting news coming out in the next couple of weeks about reducing that pain for users who are not even on 0.14 yet. But, it's just one of those things. Upgrading is a no-op if you're up to date already.
Yeah, I think for me as a module maintainer, that was definitely one of the better features, because essentially you go in there, usually your terraform.tf file, change one number, 13 to 14, and you're good. I mean, obviously we run a plan and apply and everything, but it was easy compared to the difficulty that was 11 to 12, which I think, Kristin, you put this really well, right? The switch from HCL1 to HCL2, in order to make all the new features possible, the metaphor you used, and correct me if I'm wrong, was replacing the basement while there's a dinner party going on and you didn't want to interrupt the party, right? Things have definitely gotten a lot easier. How is it doing that kind of replacement? Just looking back at 0.12 and getting HCL2 support in there.
So that's a good question, because that's when I started at HashiCorp. When they hired me, they actually thought that I would be starting right around the time 0.12 released, so that I would just learn like HCL2 and everything going forward. And then I was here almost a full year before we actually got that 0.12 out the door. So I was new, and I was mostly watching our other two engineers, James and Martin, just deep on this amazingly complicated, terrifying refactor. So basically my takeaway was I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know how to use like old or new Terraform code base. And I was like even afraid to start learning anything. So it was great to watch. And I did learn a lot following their conversations. But for the most part, my contribution was hiding in a corner and finding other projects to work on and preparing talks while they did the really heavy lifting. But it definitely taught me a lot about just how big of a refactor really anything in Terraform could be. The project I worked on, I was able to do it in a way that was an invisible and not at all breaking change, but it still took months and it was very complicated. And so it showed me just how big of a project Terraform is. And it was amazing to watch that happen.
I think in general, the community feedback has been amazing. For today's session, for example, I prepped some demo code and I put it live, I tweeted it, and I think I got the first PR from somebody from the community. Thank you, by the way, to that person if you're watching, with some changes. And that kind of feedback, I think, is very indicative of how our community is. So while we've been talking, we've got a couple of questions coming in. I think Shantanu has a really good question. How do we create a portable version of Terraform with plugins bundled? It was easily possible using 0.12, but I wasn't able to do that using 0.13 and 14. And I think, Petros, correct me if I'm wrong, 0.13.2, we introduced provider mirroring.
Well, I think the big change, not to cut you off, Karim, is actually the required provider syntax. So the biggest distinction between those two versions is namespace providers and sort of understanding the value and effects that's going to have on your configuration. One thing I would return to this practitioner with as a follow-up question is when we're talking about bundling Terraform, do they mean creating their own collection, sort of let's say a zip file, or are they actually specifically talking about the Terraform bundle tool? That part wasn't clear to me, but I can wax a little poetic, and I imagine Kristin can as well, about the namespace providers and the required providers block, because it was such a huge value add to Terraform. And I think it's been clear, and particularly me and sort of other parts of the team outside of the engineers, have some work to do about sort of evangelizing this change and how it works and how it's going to affect our practitioners. But just take community providers as an example. As of this week, we have nearly 500, that is 500 community built providers that can be initialized with Terraform init today. And that's all because of the work Kristin and some others at the team did to get us a required provider syntax. So I don't know if we got an answer to the follow-up question about whether it's bundling or creating an archive.
We actually did. So to extend the question, I want all my plugins on disk along with the binary. And I'm guessing that refers to the Terraform binary, because technically our plugins are also binaries. So that sounds like the complete bundle.
So there's a lot that changed both in 0.13 and then slightly less, but a few tweaks in 0.14 about how plugins are installed and where Terraform looks for them. So dropping a plugin in wherever the same directory that your Terraform binary is isn't going to work, because with provider source, with the concept of provider namespaces, we now can't tell if you have a Terraform provider random binary. Is that HashiCorp Terraform provider random? Is that my custom mild monkey Terraform provider random, right? So now we have to have this more complicated directory structure. You can still bundle your plugins and pass them around from your root module. So if you've got like a main git checkout, and please don't do this, but if you want to commit all your binaries into git and pass that around, it does still work. The directory path has changed. And not to cop out, but this is one where you're gonna have to look at the documentation, because it has changed a bit from 13 to 14. So that is still possible. It's going to work a little different. Terraform bundle does still work. So there's another option where Terraform, it's a separate tool, but it's built into Terraform, if that makes sense, that will bundle up binaries for you. In general, we do hope that we can encourage people to look at the new provider installation option. So you can set up a file system here and just tell Terraform where to look on disk, or network mirror if you have your binaries somewhere up on a network location. So there's a lot of options. It's still doable. It has changed a lot. And I do know that that's kind of complicating and it's been frustrating to navigate.
Yeah, I think especially with Terraform bundle, we'll try to get a link for that into the chat so y'all can follow along at home. And yeah, all in all, this is just, it's amazing how Terraform has evolved from a single binary that had everything in there to this modular concept that you can now package up in the exact way that you need. And actually, why don't we just show some demo code for this? And let me see while we talk. Let me just get my code editor started. And if I did everything right, which is very hard on these live streams, you should be seeing my Goland interface. And if that's the case, awesome. Then let's have a look at provider mirroring. So In the chat, we'll share a link to the Git repository for today's demo code, which we'll use to illustrate some of the features in 0.14. And I think network mirrors is one of the easier ones. So let's go into the Terraform providers mirror directory. And in here, what we've specified is one remote provider, and I would like to make sure that this provider actually gets mirrored. We're using the random provider from HashiCorp, not the one from Kristin, which would probably have way better pet names, but we'll go with this for now. And we'll just use the Terraform provider's mirror command. And I'm on macOS, so I need the Darwin binaries, and we'll pull these down. And we're gonna do this live, and hopefully everything works out. If not, I have a prepped GIF or GIF, depending on how you like to pronounce it. And as you can see, super quick. And if we change into that directory, then we would actually have it end to make it a little easier and more visual. You can see that we did indeed get all the required information. If you don't feel like pulling down the random provider, don't worry. We've included an animation for you so you can watch this over and over again. I know the internet and technology of 2020 is amazing like that. For now, that's enough about Terraform provider mirrors. Let's have a look at some more questions. And in the meantime, I think we have a link that we still want to share for the repository, so you can try these things out. Actually, while we wait for a few more questions, let's talk a little bit about some of the other cool 0.14 features, log files. If you come from any other language package manager, you're familiar with the concept, very likely. But Petros, I'm gonna put you on the spot here. What do the terraform.log.hcl files do, and why are they important?
That's a great question. I think we are starting to see, and actually let me scaffold this a little bit. You know, we are equally concerned with the usability of Terraform interactively for the practitioner that is running Terraform themselves on the command line, as we are with Terraform and automation, and particularly automation at very large scale where predictability is key. And so when we look at the kind of struggle we've had, I think, as a product to educate our community on, for example, pinning provider versions, that was sort of one facet of the problem that led to the development of log files. And then the other facet is that it doesn't necessarily get you the exact same version every time, depending on some of the point releases that have come out. And we found that, especially again at large collaborative scale, you want to ensure that your runs are using the same provider version day in, day out until you are ready to upgrade, whether that's because you don't need the new features, or because a bug was introduced in a previous version, or a bug was introduced in a later version. These are very complex moving systems that we're interfacing with Terraform. The APIs that our providers interact with are sometimes pretty opaque, and so they change in ways that are unpredictable. And so if you're happy with how your Terraform code base, or a given workflow is behaving for you and your team, you want to solidify that with some way to ensure consistency, and hence the log file was born. I can keep going. I don't know if I fully answered your question. The log file is created when you initialize Terraform, and our expectation is that log file, though it's a hidden file on your file system, would be committed back to VCS, so that when Terraform or your automation tool, whatever it might be, downloads your configuration to complete a Terraform run, the log file ensures that the exact same provider, not just the version, but that the hashes contained in the log file match the provider that Terraform retrieves before it runs. And so that's pretty key. There are some interesting nuances we could get into with edge cases where There's a command similar to Terraform Provider's mirror available for practitioners to manipulate the lock file, but we can save that for a little later.
I think that's definitely a good one to touch upon. And like you said, having the consistent experience, no matter if the Git tag in the backend was replaced or the binary still has the same file name, but actually completely different code in there. With the log files, that gets a lot more consistent and you're less likely to run into problems. And if you're running this at home, just run your standard Terraform init command, and from 0.14 onwards, you'll now create the .terraform.log HCL file. You've got a README in there, so it should be fairly self-explanatory. And make sure to commit that file. So one 0.14 feature that I want to touch upon is sharing and reading state from various versions. I know a lot of people split up their Terraform projects. You might have, let's say, your repositories on one version and they don't change as often, maybe your IAM, but you still need to consume something from various different projects. And usually that meant all of them had to be in the same Terraform version. But with 0.14, you can actually read Terraform state from various versions in Petros. I think, if I'm not entirely mistaken, that's up to 1.0, right?
It is. Well, so Terraform is forward compatible to Terraform 0.14 is forward compatible to Terraform 1.0 with some caveats. And I think we're, again, part of a broad set of themes that we're working on as part of Terraform moving to 1.0 is relaxing some of the constraints we've had around state file compatibility. I think of particular interest is remote state data sources, where you might have a fairly decomposed set of infrastructure resources. And so when you want to consume those, we have often put practitioners and organizations in a place where, although Terraform can read previous remote state data sources, it can't read future ones. And so you would begin to, be forced into a path where you would need to upgrade many things at once. Maybe not everything, but, definitely setting aside a significant portion of time to bring your code base along for the ride. And this is an effort to sort of make the opportunity to upgrade a little bit easier. Our goal is to expedite those upgrades. We do want customers moving to the latest stable version of Terraform as quickly as possible. And we're hoping that, although this gives them a little bit of an out, where they don't need to, the reality is that we'll actually make it easier to opportunistically upgrade when you come face to face with something, because you're not so dependent on the external states that a given configuration might require. And it's something you're going to see more and more moves towards. There was a question asked in, I think, about when we can expect 0.13.6, because as is a habit of mine.
0.13 release that supports this feature.
Yeah, I did mention that there was a coming release of 0.13 that will also have this same remote state data source compatibility. This is one of the challenges of building and managing a very technical product, is sometimes we have plans and we are not confident enough together that that the solution is quite perfect yet. And so we just wanted to make sure that we had a little bit of time to test a few things. And in fact, the delay of 0.13.6, and it's not even a delay, we hadn't really made any official commitments. That's just me putting my foot in my mouth often. And I'm happy to take that one for the team. The 0.13.6 has a few other changes that we're bringing to make quality of life better for Terraform Cloud, and that's something we're just making sure that we are comfortable with before we release.
I think the feedback we get from the community has always been instrumental in shaping how we build our product. I think it's been like that for the provisioners, and it's been like that for many other features. We'll get a link out for your Calendly so people can actually reach out to you and give us some more feedback. but you can also find all of us on Twitter. Make sure you send us pet pictures if you have really long requests, because the impossible usually takes a cat or two. And other than that, while we switch to a couple more questions, we have a repository for you if you're just joining, where we have some of the 0.14 features highlighted, like reading state from various different Terraform versions. We can see on screen right now is Terraform 0.14.2, reading state from 0.14.0 and state from 0.13.5. And you can see that we're grabbing some random pets like the swamp puppy and the water-loving domestic cat, which I believe Kristin has one of. And with that, let's go back to some of our other questions. So let's see. It's always nice seeing so much interaction in the chat going on and getting questions that are both interesting and hard to answer, because that makes our life much more interesting. So I'm curious, Kristin, with the Kubernetes provider and the Helm provider and the Alpha provider, there's some much needed functionality currently in there, but the progress and state doesn't seem to be super exciting to some of our practitioners. How do these providers get built? How does the provider protocol work there? What's the backend of this?
So the backend is the provider protocol, which is managed by Terraform. We're on provider protocol 5. So I saw this comment about this provider. So what I have is a really great, I think, non-answer, right? I'm not on the team that works with the provider SDK, and I'm not on the team that manages the Kubernetes provider. So I can't really speak to the problems they're having directly or their timelines. But my upcoming project is the next version of our provider protocol. This is going to be a minor version change. So provider developers who are listening, don't get scared. You don't need to change anything. But this is going to add some quality of life enhancements that really help, is going to make it easier for the people writing that out for Kubernetes provider and for the SDK team to kind of fix some common problems we've had. There's some limitations around how we use blocks and attributes. So we're trying to work on some backwards compatible changes that'll make that easier. So I'm hoping these things will be coming soon and help speed things along. And that is, I've spent the last month or so researching that project, and I'm going to get started on it basically this week. So I'm hoping that will help things move forward and give some like cool new power to options, let's say, for provider developers.
I think it bears repeating that the provider developers that are building or that are working on building providers for Terraform are just doing a phenomenal job. Like Petros said, nearly 500 community provided providers, community built providers, 600 I think in total, including the official ones and the partner ones. It's amazing. As we head towards 1.0, Terraform has very little it can't do right now. So I'm curious, once Terraform hits 1.0, do we anticipate a lot of changes to the schema of the Terraform state at this point?
I think that's an interesting question, because the nuance that I've been trying to talk about is actually Terraform state won't change up to 1.0. That's the guarantee we're making, is that we don't expect the state file version to change, given the roadmap and the plans we have. I think it's important to highlight that many of the features that that our user base wants or our community wants will eventually require some additional work on how those are represented in the state file. And there will be a point during the 1.0 lifecycle, or the 1.x. So perhaps, a point release, now that we have a number instead of a null number as our first integer. But either way, I'm rambling. We will need to probably make some changes. I think the way we go about making those changes once we get to 1.0 will be a little different. And I don't think we've even fully figured out how we're going to do that today. We're still, in a journey of discovery about what's best and how to really, what's the word I'm looking for? Instrument upgrades in a way that are increasingly less intrusive, but making guarantees as to like what is after 1.0 is something we can't commit to today. And I certainly wouldn't, I would actually expect some changes to the state file depending on what features we're talking about and how they might be expressed. It's an unwritten story, so stay tuned.
And as we head towards 1.0, I think with 0.13, we announced some changes to provisioners. We actually had a question around that. Are there any changes that we expect to make to provisioners? I think, Petros, we talked about this before, but it's always good to repeat this. Yes, there are changes coming. And what are those changes? Do I need to be worried?
So do you need to be worried? No. And I think that let me give some context here. The deprecation of tool-specific provisioners was around the 4 user-contributed additions to what we consider the generic provisioners that we ship with Terraform. So those would be, the generic provisioners would be, the file provisioner, local exec, and remote exec. I think that we as a team and as a tool have struggled with their existence. We accept that they are here for the 1.0 life cycle. And if there are any changes to those, I can imagine that they would be net positive, that they would be improvements where there might be deficiencies today. The tool-specific provisioners were largely unmaintained. And in fact, a couple of months ago, before we began the deprecation process, we had made a call for maintainership, and there wasn't much interest to do that. So we made the decision, after talking to some of the developers, some of the organizations that produce them or work on them or have worked on them, some of our partners, so our technology partners, who may have a name that matches the name of a provisioner, for example. We took the decision to deprecate, and we will remove them in Terraform 0.15. I think they've grown increasingly broken a little bit, and it's just, we had no intention of maintaining them. And so it was really being clear about what's next. And what's next for us, I think, and this is the part that I want to be as clear as possible about, is we are open, as always, with all things in Terraform, to listening to our community's needs. Now, we don't always take those needs at face value. We want to sometimes dig in and do some discovery work, because we're pretty confident that a lot of the needs around configuration management are either not a concern of Terraform today, or if they should be a concern, there's a better way to do that that is more Terraform-like. I can't say the name of the customer, but there's a very large customer who decided to build their own Puppet provider, for example. And so and I think that's the interesting thing is, there is still a lot of room for the community, if they have these tool specific needs, to find some solution. And we are always open to hearing about how that might be. We remain increasingly convinced that provisioners are not the way for most of that interaction. You see today, for example, another customer I met with this week, a practitioner, large open source user, relying on a tool, and they were using local exec to run curl against an endpoint, and solely because the provider for that tool didn't give them the functionality they needed to interact with the API for that tool. And so again, leaning on provisioners, because it's a very straightforward way out of real problems. I don't mean a way out in a pejorative sense. I mean, we deeply understand that users have our practitioners, our operators have a need, they have a problem to solve, and I would be with them in solving it the easiest way possible, given all the constraints that we usually have in our work and the projects we're building. So, yeah, I think the other thing that I should add about the tool-specific provisioners, that is that in many cases, those were simply scaffolding to get their tools, the tool-specific provisioners onto, for example, the remote systems, or use the locally installed tools. And it's not a dramatic leap to use the generic ones in the meantime if you're really dependent on them. We have a migration guide that the engineering team put together to help users transition away from this. And if you're really, really dependent on a specific provisioner today, a specific tool, tool for provisioning. Wow, I'm really going on here. I think the ability to use a plugin for your provisioners remains a possibility in Terraform. It's not one we strongly recommend, but it is there. So you can use a provisioner plugin today. Now there's only one that exists, in fact, but the four that are being removed from Terraform can be converted to plugins if needed. And again, they were community contributions, and we welcome our community to help solve that need a little bit. And in order to help us determine what the course of action is, because we have heard very little complaint from large practitioners or users, or even sort of the kind of open source contributors and practitioners we meet with regularly about the removal. There's been relatively little noise. Now, maybe it will start, but we're pretty confident that this is the right choice for Terraform as a whole.
And I think that community feedback has been super great. I want to highlight actually two things. First of all, concise diff. I know I've asked for this, but not just me. And I think that's been a huge request. Like, please let me see only the things I change. And that's landed in 0.14. Kristin, any thoughts you can share with us on concise diff?
Yeah, one of the things that we did in the 0.11 to 0.12 upgrade was really expand the diff so you could look at every single attribute in a resource. And what we got a fairly overwhelming response was, okay, that is too much diff, too much information. So we had one of our engineers make a fairly long project of trying to find the best way to collapse that down so we could give enough information, show users the resources and attributes that are changing without overwhelming them with every single little piece of information. So that's the new concise diff that we have. We've gotten a little feedback that maybe we went too far with our conciseness, and that's pretty valid. An interesting thing is basically we don't really know what the important thing for you to know is from any given resource, right? Like, we have an ID, but maybe that's what you don't, blah, 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 blah. Maybe that's not what you need to know. So overall, I think the concise diff is phenomenal, and the majority of the response has been super positive, but there's a little bit like maybe we are missing some information. So something we're just starting to explore is maybe can we give provider developers a way to say, hey, this is a key attribute that you should always show in a diff, even if it's not changing. So we are working to maybe extend that a little bit, but overall, I think it's been a great change and people have been very happy with it.
I think just looking at how clean the output has become for plan and apply, it's just so much better, especially when you work with clusters, cube clusters, GKE, EKS, whatever you choose. There was always so much output that most of the time wasn't relevant after the first apply, and things are getting way better. And yeah, when we talk about community contributions, one of the most unknown features of 0.14, but a super cool function is actually two functions, any true and all true, a way to evaluate if a condition actually contains the right values. I think in 0.12.20, we added condition support for variables where you can state how a variable should behave, what rules it should apply to. And don't think of it so much as governance or anything along those lines, but more basic validation. And with 0.14, we had a community contributor write those functions for us. Petros, can you talk a little bit about the process of that?
Do you mean the process of working in that specific contribution?
Yeah, and in general, how that contribution actually ended up making it into the 0.14 release?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the variable validation is one of those ideas that the team collectively saw. This is before I joined, saw a deep need for in configuration. It sort of straddles a little bit of governance and policy. It also is a really great way to ensure that you're getting consistency in the variables you're using. And so when it was introduced as an experiment, I'm being a little thoughtful here because I'm just trying to remember all of it, but the explosion of excitement was amazing. It's one of those times when the team deeply read a user need and created something new. And something we have been wanting to do, and I'm tying this into sort of a meta theme of Terraform, is make sure that when there's something like that, we are signaling that there is interest to continue evolving it. So we made it production with very few changes in 0.13. And then during the 0.14 development cycle, we were evaluating some of the asks we were getting with variable validation. And two in particular were the ability to do any and all. We didn't really get around, however, to scheduling the work. I mean, there's a lot to do, and it didn't happen. And one of our one of our community members showed up with a PR or two PRs really, that solved the need for us. And so I think it's one of those really great times where a desire we had for a specific feature perfectly intersected with somebody willing to do that thing. And that is something that as a whole, I think I particularly as a product manager can get better about communicating where we're heading, and to use that to signal occasionally where help can be solicited and expedited, because once it was done, the contributor was very open to a lot of if you go look at the PRs, for example, if you're at all interested, it's a really, really interesting interaction, because the core developers had some really serious feedback about the features, and it was a really open, constructive conversation. And I think it mirrors very much one of my favorite things about working on this team and this product in particular, is the wonderful desire to get at the right solution for everybody. And I think we did here. And it brings a huge amount of value to the process in addition to the features themselves, because it also, for us, is an open source project, a project where we are working as much as possible in public, something that is challenging often because so much of what we do is visible. It helps set how we like to interact with the people who rely on the product and want to give something back to it. And hopefully, if I've sort of, again, rambled around a bit here, I've covered a couple of bases that are helpful.
I think it's clearly one of those topics where we're all excited about contributions, and it's a tool built by thousands of people, hundreds of people internally. You are two of them, but obviously there's a much larger community, and it's just so amazing having all that input. So Arthur, thank you for your contributions, but also thank you to all the other contributors for making my life as an infrastructure engineer much better.
That's okay. I've noticed in chat, I just wanted to follow up on the provisioner comment, because I think I wasn't clear and I don't want to terrify anybody here. File, local exec, and remote exec are here to stay. Those are not being removed. I think we wish they were, but that is not the world we live in today. And I fully agree with the assertion that for now, they are definitely a necessary evil in Terraform land. There are far too many use cases where we cannot remove those, and we have no intention to. And actually, again, I'm sorry I was unclear. That was what I was alluding to. Those we actually expect to improve a little bit as they stick around. There are some weird, rough edges around those, particularly on specific platforms. I won't mention them by name, but specific platforms. And we have some intention to fix some of those rough edges because we realize they are so critical, especially as a get out of jail card for a lot of use cases. So the only provisioners that are being removed are the Puppet provisioner, the Habitat provisioner, the Chef provisioner, and the Salt masterless provisioner, all of which were unmaintained community contributions.
Provisioners are last resort. Usually there's a Terraform provider for the stuff that you want to be doing. And if not, then we have very good guides on our Learn platform that help you to get started with building providers. Providers is where the cool kids are at, so you definitely want to be in that space. Just so much more fun. While we wait for more questions, oh, and thank you, Petros, for answering that question, because you helped clarify that very well. So while we wait for more questions to come in, if you're just joining us, you're about 45 minutes late to the Terraform 0.14 highlights, but that's okay. We'll have this up on YouTube later. If you're new to Terraform 0.14 and you're just trying to upgrade on our Learn platform, and we'll get a link for that shared as well. We have a couple of new tutorials on how 0.14 changes things and what things are changed. And just a great way to spend the next few weeks as you're winding down the year. You know, nobody at the office, which, let's be honest, it's your home office, so you're the only person there anyway. You know, pick up some new skills. We have I think at this point we have at least 2 tutorials up there on sensitive input variables, which is very nice. And the other one is lock and upgrade provider versions from top of my head. And let's see, what other questions do we have that we can answer at this point? I'm really surprised nobody so far asked when 1.0 was coming, and I'm excited about that. Because at that point, we could have talked a little bit about our definition of 1.0. I know, Kristin, you gave an amazing talk about that I think we should share out the link to that again. HashiCorp's definition of a 1.0 differs from everyone else's because we hold ourselves to a standard that works for us. And it to me, as somebody who'd been using Terraform since I think 0.4, getting that understanding was just immensely helpful. And maybe, Kristin, could you give a few thoughts on when we think it will be ready? Sorry, what we need to know that it will be ready, not the when, obviously.
For 1.0, we're close, and I'm afraid to say anything that'll make Petros unmute and start yelling at me for sharing secrets, but we're really close. We've been pretty hyper-focused. It may not feel like that, you know, when we've got all these kind of random releases and features, but all of the background, you know, even that bizarre invisible refactoring project I've been doing, the main goal is to get everything stable so we can call 1.0. So we're hoping to see that not late next year. I don't want to say anything else. Petros might yell at me. But we're actually like really happy with the stability we've gotten. Things like that remote state read, like that was actually a really important compatibility promise that we start to say, hey, we can actually read state files from different Terraform versions, because that hasn't changed in several releases. So let's make that promise. So we're getting a lot closer to that. And it's really exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing that day. It's like, it now feels like it's going to be in my lifetime. And frankly, 2 years ago, I had no idea when we'd ever get there.
And actually, if we travel back in time a little longer, you used to be a practitioner. You used to be somebody who would operate using Terraform, and then you became one of the developers of Terraform. How has that journey been?
It's been a lot of fun. I was an infrastructure engineer at Nike for several years, and I used Terraform to build up Nike.com and a whole bunch of our inner infrastructure and AWS accounts. So I was at that point a fairly deep Terraform user, which is why I decided to apply for HashiCorp, because it was just the coolest thing I'd ever used. One funny thing is when I was prepping for my interview, I thought, hey, maybe I could kind of think a couple of the like key pain points we've had in Terraform in case somebody wanted to prove that I knew it. And by the time I went and looked up the GitHub issues, it had already like released new features and I was just a version behind. So I was a really heavy Terraform user, and something that's been really fascinating to me now that I've been here for 2.5 years is I barely know how users use Terraform anymore. It probably sounds like something you don't want me admitting, but it's fascinating how the deeper I get into writing Terraform code, the farther removed I get from doing interesting, complicated things in Terraform. And I know a lot of the engineers on our team like also manage complicated infrastructure, so they're not necessarily all as out of touch as I'm going to say I am. But I think that's been the most interesting thing for me. I can write really good examples using the random pet provider if you want to see the features I've been building. But if you get into this really deep module composition, our users ask amazing questions on the forum. They're doing really awesome things. One of my favorite things to do is look at every new release and think, man, Kristin of 4 years ago would have just been crying in joy to have this feature. It is awesome to see. And I miss actually doing that. I kind of miss being an infrastructure engineer. I love what I do. Like, this has been a big win, but it's been a fascinating change to watch and how I think about Terraform and how I know to use Terraform.
It's certainly come a long way in the past 4 years, and things have gotten so much easier. I was talking to somebody this week, and we talked a little bit about the null resource, and was like, yeah, if only there was a way to do something with SQL in Terraform. And we actually have somebody who built a SQL provider that you could use to do some of these operations. It was just so cool that the mindset used to be, well, if I can't do it in Terraform, I'll just use a provisioner, I'll use a null resource, to actually, let's go to the registry and see if there's a provider for that. And in a way, it feels like that, I don't know if we can name other product names here, but it's one of those smartphones that used to have an app for everything. And that's pretty much where Terraform is going for me. So in the meantime, I think, Petros, question for you. Do we have any low code or other resources for a learning developer on how to build a provider for Terraform?
We do. And I love the question for a couple of reasons. I think one of the biggest things I've learned and enjoyed working with our community is if I say something like, if you don't want to use provisioners, you should build a provider, I'm going to get challenged on it. And I love that. And I think there's something I wanted to echo from Kristin's sentiment about Terraform, which is, our practitioner base uses Terraform in ways, and I think I mentioned something similar earlier, the way we cannot imagine in many cases. And often I go to conversations and I am the least knowledgeable about the actual usage of the tool in terms of solving their problems. I'm the least knowledgeable person in the room. And I think that's a great place to be, because it allows us to continue to learn and do discovery about how to build the tool. So about providers particularly, if you're not familiar with HashiCorp's Learn Guides, it's probably the best way to get started with Terraform today. You can dive in. There's a lot of very straightforward prescriptive examples about how to sort of get through some of the basics and some of the not so basic things. And we do have a guide specifically on creating your own provider. It's pretty simple. Plot twist, I have started it myself recently. I decided after being here for a year, I should really understand how to build my own provider. And I have a use case in mind that I'm not going to share yet, but it may or may not be related to provisioners. So I think, yeah, users, practitioners, operators, engineers should check it out. It will require understanding a little bit of Go. And some familiarity with the API you want to interact with when you're building your own. But the Learn Guide is really, really fantastic for getting started in that way. And there's another topic that we could jump into here, which is 0.14 shipped alongside a fairly significant change to our technical documentation. And I think understanding that difference between the technical documentation of Terraform and something more prescriptive like Learn, it can be helpful, because our documentation as it is today, and I think we'll work on changing this a little bit, doesn't contain a lot of very sort of practical, concrete examples, because it is really about the technical reality of the features that we're presenting to our users. And we've separated that out now into the Terraform language docs and the Terraform CLI docs. They were pretty intertwined before in a way that our practitioners found it challenging to, and I say this as a practitioner myself, I found it challenging to find what I needed in the documentation. I would often struggle to understand where one concept that's linked to another, where the rest of that story would be. And within a few minutes of us playing with the new layout before it went live, we were like, yes, all the language docs are in one place, all the CLI docs are in a separate place. And it's so much more clear how, when I'm trying to understand a deeply nuanced feature or the nuances of a feature, where to go for that information. So I recommend checking that out, both our documentation and our Learn guides.
I think the Learn guides have been phenomenal to follow along, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about your provider. Kristin, you mentioned your own random provider. What prompted you to build one of those?
Yeah, so that wasn't actually just a made-up example. When I talked about the research I'd been doing for the next provider protocol version, I built that using, so I built the code in core, and then I built a provider using Terraform plugin Go, adding my new protocol changes. So Terraform plugin Go, okay, so I should step back. We've got the provider SDK that our enablement team manages, and that's got a really lovely framework that makes it as easy as possible to write providers for Terraform. There's also Terraform plugin Go, which has been very, very recently released, and that's the very low level. It's almost a direct protocol binding level. So it was really easy for me to write because it basically felt like I was just writing more Terraform code. It was almost a direct translation of the protocol in Terraform. So as part of that research, I re-implemented the random provider, or at least the random pet resource, using that plugin and my new protocol change. So if you're looking for that real low code, if you want to feel like you're in Terraform's guts without actually getting into Terraform, I would check out Terraform plugin Go and write a provider using that. You definitely need to know Go for that, but it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that process.
I feel like in the future, we'll have one of these office hours just centered around how to build for our various tools. I know my colleague is working on something like that, and I'm just excited to have more of our developer community get together and work on that. In the meantime, while we wait for some more questions, you might have heard it, AWS reInvent is going on. We're doing a lot in terms of community office hours, specifically around AWS tooling. We have office hours coming up next week for Terraform specifically, where we talk about some of the new releases that we definitely are not talking about today, but exciting stuff. We have office hours for all of our other tools as well, so it doesn't have to be Terraform. And you can see how we integrate with those. And in the meantime, do we have any last questions? Yeah, so if you're just joining in the chat on the right side, we shared out a lot of links to what Kristin and Petros were talking about for the Go SDK, the Learn collection for building providers, the plugin SDK, sorry, the plugin SDK and the plugin-go repository. These names were a little bit confusing, I have to admit. Yeah, plenty of reading material. As you're heading into the Christmas break, I think there's definitely a lot of new content that you could be looking at. You could either build your own provider or, Petros, I think ARM64 support, right? It's available.
ARM64 support for Linux. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to highlight just that the sort of the bar that we need to cross, the barrier we need to cross when we want to support a new platform is that our providers need to support it. And so we had reached a point where the bulk of providers were supporting Linux ARM64, and then we were able to do the same at core. And I think there's a pretty frequent follow-on question these days because of a certain M1 chip that a particular like fruit themed technology company released. When Darwin ARM64 is going to come, and I think there are a lot of similar dependencies that we'll have to filter up through our provider ecosystem and Go itself, and then we'll be able to tackle it. So stay tuned.
Yeah, and don't just stay tuned to those news. If you've been following HashiCorp for a while, a couple of years ago, feels like a couple of years ago, we did the Million Container Challenge, C1M. Today, we're going to be talking about C2M, the 2 million container challenge. And if I'm not entirely mistaken, 3:30 Eastern, just time zones. We'll definitely have a recording of that. We'll be looking at Nomad 1.0. We're going to be scheduling 2 million containers on 6,000 plus AWS Spot instances, pretty much all over the world. And I think it's going to be super exciting seeing how Nomad from 0.31 or 0.3.1, which we use for the 1 million container challenge, evolved to 1.0 and 2 million containers. It's going to be a blast seeing how this kind of benchmark goes. And with that, we're at the end of our office hours. But one last question from Mohammed. Typing code as 0.12 or 0.13, will this be compatible with 0.14 features? It's an easy one.
Yes. Yeah. For 0.12, remember, you need to add the required provider syntax for namespace providers. That's the change, but the rest is good to go.
And to make that even easier, if you go to registry.terraform.io, we actually have a dropdown where you can just copy and paste the required syntax. I do it all the time because a lazy engineer is a good engineer, I keep telling myself. Also, no spelling mistakes if you copy somebody else's written word. With that, thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Petros, for joining us today. It's been a blast. Thank you to our audience for joining us today and for giving us really, really interesting questions. As we mentioned, check in the chat. We have a couple more office hours coming up, and we'll see you at one of those. Have a great day, you all.